Hello, it's David and Brent again. We're joining you this week to follow up with the latest that we have on our mind with Ag Forecast Network and things we've been thinking about and ideas worth sharing. We're recording this on Thursday, the 23rd. And the first one, Brent, that I wanted to talk about is I wrote an article about winter wheat acres. We had a question in the Forecast Network. You and I both grew up in the Great Plains. We grew up combining wheat in the summer, so we like wheat a lot. I think wheat production has had a lot of implications on corn and soybeans, especially over the last decade, but it's often overlooked. So the USDA earlier in this month got overshadowed. The report got overshadowed by the trade war, but the USDA came out and said winter wheat acres are down a little bit in 2020. They said 30.8 million acres, which is down from 31.2, so about 300,000 acres lower than last year. So that resolved the question that we had in the Forecast Network about winter wheat acres changing. It provides a little bit of insight into what total wheat acres might be. There's another question about that, asking about more or less than 45 million acres. It also provides some insight into the corn and soybean situation. I think the big piece of news from the winter wheat report is that we didn't see a big uptick in acres, but we also didn't see a big downturn. There's some tables in that story that I wrote, and we'll link to that, where there had been some 1, 2, 3.5 million acre swings in wheat, mostly to the downside. And when we see 3.5 million acre decline in winter wheat, that probably shows up. Those acres get planted, and they probably show up in corn and soybeans. So corn and soybeans for 2020 didn't get a relief, so we didn't see an increase in wheat acres, but we didn't see pressure from a downturn in winter wheat acres. So I also took a look at what happens when how does winter wheat acres impact total wheat acres? What's the relationship there? It's sort of interesting. There's 2 years in the past where you have a small decline in winter wheat acres and actual total wheat acres turn higher. So take a look at that story. I think winter wheat acres could actually come in above 45 million.
Total wheat acres.
Total wheat acres, yep. Even though we saw winter wheat decline, I think there's a decent shot we see total wheat acres increase. But again, just thinking about that 180 million acres for corn and soybeans from last year, how does that play out?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, maybe we're finally to the point where we can see some stability in winter wheat acres. I mean, it's just plummeted. And speaking as someone who lives in wheat country, I mean, it's just kind of shocking to drive around the country and just not see wheat. There's just not that much out there anymore.
And you're part of the problem, right? I mean, when you look at your budgets, winter wheat's just not appealing.
Yeah,
as the other
it's really hard.
alternatives.
Somebody asked me going on last night, how high do wheat prices have to get to make it attractive? And over $5 a bushel, I think. And we're a ways away from that on the cash side.
Yeah. So thinking about 2020, I think the corn and soybean markets, they didn't get a good signal, but they didn't get a bad signal. And so it's an important update. And I guess the way we look at it, winter wheat sort of goes to bat first when we think about the acreage debate. Winter wheat gets planted in the fall, those acres get allocated first. And so we're starting to put together the pieces of what the 2020 acreage debate will finally come to.
Well, it's interesting you mentioned that because there's been some movement, I think, this week in some of the variables on that debate, and that's we've seen soybean prices fall a fair amount relative to corn, and the more, if that continues much longer, I think it suggests a lot more corn acres. And so I'm going to be watching that very closely in the next few weeks to see if that kind of stabilizes or if it continues to deteriorate.
I just saw a tweet, and I'll link to the tweet. And we had talked about in an earlier episode how soybeans have become more favorable over the last 6 months. And the point of this tweet was to show, really since the beginning of the year, soybeans have been losing that edge. And in this particular tweet, it has the price spread between the soybeans divided by corn, and that ratio got to a high of about 2.43.
Mm-hmm.
Now it's down to 2.36. And so it's backed off a lot. This particular, the tweets from Ken Morrison, he said that, the swing has been about a 5 to 10 acre change in revenue. I think that's really, we're headed towards this end of March, 1st of April decision time for producers. And this is going to be in the back of everyone's mind as we're sort of moving here on the margin. Shifting gears a bit, I wrote a second article I talked about last week, and you really inspired me you motivated the idea, thinking about the seasonality of China's purchases. And the Forecast Network question of relevance is, will we get to 35 billion here in 2020? And I said in last week's episode, you got to keep in mind there's probably a lot of weight in the back months. So a lot of weight going in. And so there's a lot of charts. There's 7 charts in this second post, but I really opened up the can of worms. I wanted everyone to take a look at it. I think there's 3 key points. The first is there is a lot of seasonality in China's total ag and related products purchases. In fact, you have to get to the end of August before you clear the 50%. So in other words, China makes on a monthly basis, gets to half of all their purchases at the end of the 8th month. And so we just can't take month by month and just sort of, multiply those up. The second point is it's because of soybeans. Soybeans drives this. And so you have to get, more than 50% of the soybean purchases from China in the past, before the trade war, occurred in the last 3 months of the year, October, November, December. And so then the third way I looked at this data was, what's the seasonality of China's purchases of everything other than soybeans? And you know what? That's very flat and consistent throughout the year. It ranged from a low of any month giving about 7% of the total to a high of 10%. And so about 8 or 9% was the monthly average. And so the takeaway from this that I shared in the story was that if we're going to see a big surge in spending, we might be able to see it in that monthly data happening in the non-soybean purchases first. If we see a big uptick, that's going to be where I'll be looking for it. And the second one is, I think the soybean story is going to be disappointing and lackluster unless South America has a production hiccup. That soybean number could be really frustrating as we get into the fall because China just doesn't make a lot of soybean purchases. I believe it's from April to August or September. Each month accounts for about 3 to 4% of total soybean purchases. So it's it's not zero,
Nothing.
but it's very low. It's very seasonal, kind of a boom and bust. And so, we're going to keep track of this pace. I think there's some pace ideas that we can keep in mind, but the seasonality is going to be really key to understanding the implications of a pace here in 2020.
Yeah, and all the reports I've been reading out of South America suggest it's not a small crop, but a big crop. So just important to keep that seasonality in mind. Yeah, and the soybeans probably drive it tremendously because they're about, in 2017 they were half of all of the things we exported to China. So just important to keep that in mind. But you're going to see a lot of people, kind of be negative about the trade deal, I think, in the coming months.
So to frame up what you just said, half of our sales to China before the trade war were soybeans, and half of the soybean number happens in 3 months. And so about 25% of the purchases of total occur in soybeans, or occur in the last 3 months coming from soybeans by itself. And so I think the story and the narrative about China's purchases, because we're already at close to the February, the trade deal takes some time to get into place. So there's some February and March opportunities to export soybeans, but January is almost, behind us. As a result, I've actually increased my probability. I was pretty bleak on that question. I'm up to about a 46% probability. I guess one way of looking at that's maximum uncertainty. 50-50 is maximum uncertainty. of course, I'm looking for those non-soybean purchases to be a really key part of that. And I reserve the right to change it. And believe me, if we get to May and June and I don't see a spike in those, it's going to be tough, I think.
Yeah.
So most of my, I guess, increase is just more understanding of the situation. I'm a little more confident given the non-soybean purchases don't have as much seasonality, and there's an opportunity to really ramp that up. And don't have to play catch up, I guess, in that space.
Well, I would just, I suppose we can wrap up pretty soon, but one of the things I was just going to mention was thinking about, I've just done a whole bunch of meetings across Nebraska and Iowa and one in South Dakota. And I thought maybe it'd be interesting. Some of the questions that I got are always interesting. I think I learn more from the questions than I think I do putting the stuff together. And been getting a lot of questions about hemp. And I always respond with, hemp is going to be hard, and you have to really realize that it's not a get-rich-quick scheme, and it's going to take a lot of work and a lot of expertise to get good at it. There's some just wild stories coming out of Colorado on what people have done with hemp and some of the challenges they've faced. So that's interesting. One last night had a guy ask me about prevented plant acres and the implications for planting in 2020. And at first I was thinking he was talking about, well, are they even going to be able to plant the prevent plant? And I hadn't even really thought about this, but the interesting angle on it is, well, why would anybody plant anything other than corn on prevent plant acres? And so his idea was that, that's going to bias overall corn plantings up because you're starting with a pretty big chunk of acres that are probably going to go to corn. Now, Dave and we talked about this a little offline. I don't know how sound that hypothesis really is. It sounds good, but I think we should probably do some looking into that, before we kind of assume it's going to happen. But it was interesting anyway.
It definitely feels like one of those, at a farm level, at a field level, I think that makes a lot of sense. I think the big question is, how does that pencil out? How does that multiply up to the national level? Good question. One of the questions I was getting a lot growing on, and probably a reflection of my meetings in December, now your meetings in January, was a trade payment for 2020. Now that we have the phase one trade deal, that maybe is less optimistic. And Sonny Perdue, actually this week, one of our news clips, it was very clear producers should not be expecting an MFP payment for 2020 production. They did say they're going to pay that third round tranche for 2019. Brent and I sort of rib each other about this from time to time. It was the same Secretary of Ag who 14 months ago was telling producers don't expect it in 2019. And one of the things to keep in mind is MFP payments are good because they don't distort the markets. They're bad because they don't distort the markets. There's still a ton of soybean carryover. You look at some of this China soybean purchasing pattern. There could be a drought of positive news in the soybean market, and so MFP in 2020 is going to be worth keeping an eye on. Probably not a overwhelming possibility. I forget where my probability is right now, but something that's sort of not as in the forefront as where it was a few months ago.
It's not zero. I think I have it at 5 to 10%, somewhere in that neighborhood, but
I'm above that.
It is an election year, and he was pretty adamant a couple years ago we weren't going to have another one, and lo and behold, we had one. So I think it's much more unlikely this time, given that the whole rationale behind it was the trade war, and I don't think they could kind of come out and say, well, yeah, the deal isn't working. So I think it'll be hard for them to make that payment again this year, but they might be able to call it something else because if prices don't come up, there's still going to be a lot of stress in the farm sector.
Yes. We think about the budgets quite a bit. sort of the difference between economic break even and some losses in the last few years had been centered around those MFP payments. And so
Yeah,
they were
absolutely.
making a big impact on the budget. Brent, we've been emailing about decision journals. You're going to write some
Oh,
stuff on the
yeah.
Forecast Network. Do you want to tease that up just a little
So
bit?
one last thing, I guess, and then so it's interesting. In the last 2 weeks, I've seen a lot of some of the newsletters and things I read talking about decision journals, and that's really what we have built into the Ag Forecast Network, a way for you to kind of log your ideas, and someone write a short article about how to do that effectively. And I think it's super powerful. I've been encouraging people, even in their marketing plan, keep track, try and do it regularly. What was happening, what was the uncertainty I was thinking about, what did I think of it, what was the decision I made, and then come back to it and how did it resolve, and think about that. And so I'll write a little bit about that this week, but I think it's something that it's one of those things we do. If we do, I think it will help us understand our biases and help us make better decisions.
Well, one thing I'll add to that is if you read the psychology literature a little bit, you start to learn that our brains have evolved in a way that to really benefit us. And so it weaves a narrative together to support whatever hypothesis we might have originally thought. It supports our conclusions, I guess. So it supports the outcomes that happen. So if we kind of thought A was going to happen, but B did, our brain will help us think that we knew it was going to be
We
B all the
actually,
time.
yeah.
And so a decision journal is a way to categorize all the things that you were actually thinking about. That way, when you do go back and reflect on what went wrong 6 months ago, you can take that bias, your brain's self-pleasing bias, and take it out and help you really understand where your shortfalls were. Speaking of shortfalls, one last story we wanted to share coming out of Major League Baseball. When you start thinking about uncertainty, you see it everywhere. So, and Brent, maybe you know it better. So the Astros, fired their manager. It came out that the last few years they had been stealing the sign, the between the catcher and the pitcher, their communications about what pitch they were going to send. And it's just a very interesting story. One of the details was they had a replay camera coming out of center field, very standard, but the coach and the players were standing in the dugout, and when the pitcher or the catcher sent the sign for the fastball, they would bang bats on trash cans to alert the batter. That way the batter would have, remove the uncertainty about what pitch was coming from the pitcher down the plate, and maybe have an advantage in making that pitch. That hit.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I mean, it's like that. Most of us still couldn't hit a major league fastball, right? But if you're a professional player and you remove the uncertainty of whether it's a fastball or not, it gives you a much greater chance to hit it, and those little benefits can really add up. And it also reminded me of that book Black Edge, which is about the SAC Capital fiasco. Which if you kind of like Wall Street and that kind of stuff, it's a really, really interesting read about how they just push the limits of insider trading to gain an advantage, and what that advantage meant over a long period of time has made Stephen Cohen, one of the wealthiest people in the world. And he wasn't always right, but that little bit of extra information that was probably illegal or was illegal really, really added up. It's a good story. So if you need some reading, that's a good one to read.
Yeah, and and we'll put a link in the transcription for listeners. It's interesting because at one point, going back to the Astros, you could do a Moneyball type scenario and say, okay, when the count is 3 balls and 2 strikes, this pitcher typically throws this type of pitch. You can say there's an 80% chance of it being a fastball. And that's not, illegal, but you sort of head down this, as you try to remove uncertainty, you sort of head down this path where all of a sudden you're breaking the rules, as Stephen Cohen found out, and as the Astros found out. So
yeah,
it's interesting. Well, that's all we have for this week. Thank you all for joining us. Email us any questions or comments or thoughts that you have in the meantime. Otherwise, we'll see you again next week.